Hello and welcome to Buildings of Tomorrow. My name is John Lester, and in today's episode, we are talking about breaking data silos and how we can build a higher and a better user experience for those out there in the building industry. I'm really lucky to be joined by Elisa Rönkä. She is the Global Head of SaaS Sales for Digital Buildings at Siemens Smart Infrastructure, and she's a bit of a returning expert because we've had a recording and a conversation before. Elisa, thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you for having me again.
It's always fun. It's an absolute pleasure as always. And as I mentioned, we have had a couple of conversations in the past, and we talked a lot about user experience in the building. We talked a lot about the tenants and the building users, what they experience when they're in spaces, and we also talked a little bit about UX or user experience and how important it was for us as an industry as we start to get more involved in the daily operation of a tenant, a facility manager, of a building user, and enable them to really help achieve their goals in these buildings. So we want to talk today a little bit more about that user experience and creating that higher user experience, and then the link between the data and the data that's sometimes siloed and broken up in the business. But before we get to the data, let's talk about user experience. For you, when we talk about user experience in the building, what do we mean?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think in general, usually when we talk about UX in the building, we talk about the tenants or the user of the building, their user journey, and how do they, experience any of the activities that they do inside the building. And this is also what we talked about last time, that the building really needs to contribute towards whatever you try to achieve inside that building. But we
Yep.
sometimes forget to talk about UX also from just a very simple system point of view. What kind of systems are you using as a user in the building? Are those really catering for you? Are they intuitive? Is that helping you to perform better in whatever your task is? And I think we really, when speaking about UX in the built environment, we really need to kind of span across both those individual systems and the user experience of those systems to the user experience of the actual whole building.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's quite a large scope. And achieving, creating this higher user experience and delivering the different requirements, the different expectations from such a broad group is a little bit of a challenge. What, why is it so hard, and why are we struggling, or have we struggled in the past as an industry to really deliver this?
Well, I think as an industry, we've been looking at, first of all, buildings as, kind of, I always call them human warehouses, so that they are just these physical structures that are there to, provide a very basic task. And we kind of haven't maybe demanded more when we think about from the tenant or user of the building experience. And then if we think about the different systems that are used to operate the building, those have been designed by engineers for engineers, and you can imagine how it isn't necessarily meant to be something that's super intuitive and easy to onboard and easy to use. And I think inherently these two aspects have been kind of building upon each other to really, yeah, just lose focus on the topic of user experience. And I'm really glad that that's now shifting and changing, because we no longer talk only about the physical building, it's also the digital building. And the expectations are just very different from what they maybe used to be in the built environment. So I think it's a very welcomed change.
Yeah, a welcome change, but also one that highlights a little bit of, we have some structural challenges when we start to talk about this digital building, and these new expectations. Because as you mentioned, many of the systems within the buildings were built by engineers for engineers, but they were also somehow built in a very focused or blinkered manner. They focused on one thing, they solved one problem or one collection of problems, and they were never really designed to talk to each other, to share information, and to be open in any way, shape, or form. How much does that get in the way of us really building this ultimate UX?
So it is a massive, massive issue because we also have regulatory constraints. So some systems need to even be closed, and then we have, let's say, a lot of proprietary technology that is kind of trying to be as close as possible to make, let's say, vendor lock-in, as we often talk about it in the built environment. and then even if we try to be open and we try to have as much of this kind of breaking of the silos and cross-pollinating data, as I call it, we land into the issues of no one being very used to doing that in that environment and in that context. So it becomes like a major challenge to solve, and I think this is probably one of the major challenges a lot of the players in the building industry are trying to solve. How do we create some kind of a common data model that we can feed then all the different, let's say, systems applications from, in a way that you can also allow a kind of cross pollination, because I think that is where the intelligence will increasingly be, not only from a user experience perspective, but I think that will all flow into that building experience, is if you're actually able to look at all these different touch points of that user of building, and what they try to achieve, and it rarely is linked only to one system. That would be a very, let's say, niche user experience. Usually it overlaps with a lot of different systems, so it's vital that we are able to break down those data silos, bring that data in a unified format that we can then easily build upon and create new value propositions, new outcomes for the users, whatever those might be.
Yeah, I understand. And you talk there about breaking down these silos, this common data environment, so we can start to collect information. Is it enough to collect it, or how do we enable the tenants in the building, the owners of the building, to actually use this data? Because we've had many conversations on this show with different stakeholders about data, and one of the common themes is data for data's sake is not really worth much for us. It makes us feel good, it proves what's possible, but if we can't use it for stuff, we can't use it to make decisions, it doesn't add any value. How do we support in this use case, when we start to build this user experience, how do we support those people like tenants, like building users, to get value from this data, even if they're not engineers, for engineers' sake?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a few years ago, everyone was focusing on just how do we gather data, like the way,
Mm-hmm.
how can we just get as much data as possible, and then eventually figured out that, oh, we're sitting on a massive data dump and no one knows what on earth to do with it. And then, let alone if you figure out how to, let's say, make some sense of that data, maybe in different systems, you run into the problem, what if something changes? How do you then maintain this data as well? And for this common data environment is absolutely vital. And we have been working towards this, let's say, in our own development activities, and maybe more to come in the future on that front, but also through acquisitions. So we just acquired Ecodomus as a company, exactly to help in this use case. How can you have a common data environment, and kind of build upon a digital twin based on this, without having to always be extremely inefficient in updating information in all these various sources. So it's kind of very basics that we're talking about, but something that has been surprisingly neglected when everyone was just hyping over how collecting as much as data as possible and then maybe figuring out something to do with it. But kind of that middle piece of deriving a unified way of interpreting that data has been a
Mm-hmm.
little bit maybe forgotten in the midst of that hype.
Forgotten, and maybe even more difficult than we ever really expected. There's probably this common data environment, and like you mentioned, companies like Ecodomos and others really building somehow a standardized approach to make this easier, to make this faster, to make this more sustainable. Because you talked about maintenance, of course. Taking a snapshot of data tomorrow doesn't help us the day after tomorrow unless we're able to maintain and manage that moving forward. So that's a huge step in the right direction. When we talk about that user experience and beyond, often, especially when we step into the software space, user experience, people start to think, not just about how things look, but we also talk about the workflows and how people then, they use a solution and they get to get to the answer that they need. They find out the information that they need. How is modern technology? How you mentioned intelligence before. How are we starting to move as an industry in this direction to make the usability, but also the workflows for these target audiences faster, easier, and stronger?
Yeah, I think definitely we used to maybe look at exactly how do we gather that data, and then how could we just get transparency to the status quo of what's happening. And whilst that's important, and certainly a prerequisite for any additional intelligence, that only goes so far if you actually don't have that actionability on that data, and what can you then or should you be doing next in order to perform your task better. And there exactly we need to link to these different workflows, and there are so many different workflows that happen in a building. Of course, we have the facility management are working their own things, but we have things like costing, and you name it. There is a lot of different or a lot of different stakeholders with very specific workflows. And I think, if we manage really well the whole deriving the data, making intelligence out of it, and then feeding that and cross-pollinating that data, all these different stakeholders are able to actually perform better in whatever they are doing on the daily basis. And this is really where it becomes increasingly important that we get out of those silos, because we create much more efficiency also from a let's say a resourcing point of view, that you don't have to have like kind of one person looking after one system, but you can actually get efficiency across, as there are some, let's say, maybe joint initiatives that are catering around that user experience of the building. But this is really something that, as you mentioned, hasn't traditionally been addressed so well in terms of the systems that are deployed in a building, and this is something we massively want to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned before, the reason we want to break down the silos is because different information, different data from distant systems helps many different people. So it's that reuse, that access, and the application of the access to this data to these different workflows is really where the power comes from. Otherwise, we do end up back in this same cycle where we build something from scratch to address one workflow, and then we build something again from scratch to address the next workflow, and we end up with a huge amount of effort to make any serious impact. And the more and more we want to apply this kind of technology, the more and more we need to have freedom of access, but also that ability to cross-pollinate. I love that word or that phrase that you used of cross-pollinating, to really pick things up from every different corner and bring them together for whatever you need for this particular workflow, without building a whole infrastructure around that. So we talked in the last few minutes, we've talked about breaking the data silos, bringing that data into this common data environment where we have some consistency in how we collect, how we maintain, and also how we access that data, using intelligence, using smart solutions to then grab that data and use it to, depending on the workflow, use it to find solutions and find that steps, and then also ensuring that we have that breadth of scope around, not just the individual stakeholders, the users of the building, but also the facility managers, the owners, the operators, and all of their requirements. What's our next step as an industry that is getting better? Like you mentioned, common data environments like companies like Ecodomos are starting to push in this direction. What's the next step as an industry, or what's the next step for you and your team when you're saying, "Hey, here's this problem, and we're getting close. Let's make this happen"?
So I think that the transition is towards a real platform approach. And I know we've talked about platforms in terms of smart buildings for quite a while, but to actually have a platform approach in terms of data as well, I think this is really where we need to get to. And then not only, again, gathering the data and having that unified, let's say, data model, but also how do we have AI enabled intelligence in terms of interpreting that data, making smart analytics based on it, looking more at the predictive elements, and all of that kind of is building upon the fact that we need to have the silos broken down, and yeah, move towards a real platform approach. So this is also what my team is very heavily working towards at the moment, and yeah, there are some interesting things to come.
Yeah, I think that that's an exciting thing because it is an industry, something we talk about a lot. Let's call it, many people try. It's not easy, but it's certainly an area, as you mentioned, that we need to get to. And it's also something that you don't do alone, right? Like there need to be partners, there need to be people participating from different corners of the market with different skills and different assets. And if it really is that platform approach, this enables that direction. How could that look like for you? If we start to find those different partners, we start to find those different contributors, Is this what we need, that collaboration to get us to the end, let's call it, or to get us on that next step onto the train?
Absolutely. I mean, it's all about openness. It's all about collaboration, ecosystem thinking. That is how you really create value on top of a platform approach. And I think this is where the industry as a whole is moving towards. But in the end, it's all about the business optimization. So how can you actually create more value for the business that's being run within that building, whatever that business might be. And I think everything that's being done in terms of systems, in terms of UX, in terms of workflows needs to feed in to those kind of measurable KPIs that we are looking at, and then we can actually call it a success in terms of technology as well.
Yeah, and that's a great place for us to finish today. I think, as you say, it doesn't really matter what happens from a technology perspective. It doesn't matter what challenges are overcome. If the customer gets value, then this is a step in the right direction. And if that then is scalable and creates more impact, happy days. Elisa, thanks so much for joining me. It's always fun to chat. I get the feeling we're going to have more conversations. I always say that, but hey, here you are back again after such a time away. So I hope that it's not the last time. And thank you so much for lending us your time and your knowledge today.
Looking forward to the next chat, John. Always a pleasure.
Bring it on. And also thank you to everyone out there who is listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment on this episode. Look out for new episodes coming every couple of weeks. We're having a lot of great conversations around artificial intelligence and additional conversations like we've had today with Elisa around how do we get hold of this data and start to use it more effectively. So keep your eyes out for that. And until then, we'll see you soon.